Hello, my name is Kyle Soley. I'm a partner here at Reed Smith, and with me is Sebastian Watt, also a lawyer here at Reed Smith. Today we're going to be talking about brook trout. We're going to be talking about garbage, litter, and we're going to be talking about fireworks. And actually, we're not going to be talking just about these things. We're going to be talking about the state constitutions and their limitations on taxation. And we're going to be using brook trout, litter and garbage, and fireworks as case studies to walk you through this with some interesting cases involving brook trout, litter, and fireworks.
Sounds like an explosive presentation.
It is an explosive presentation, but really what the takeaway that we want is to get those who are tuning into this focused on state constitutions. Whenever you hear constitutional issues with taxes, you typically immediately think about the Commerce Clause of the Federal Constitution, sometimes the Due Process Clause of the Federal Constitution, but less often do you think about the various state constitutional provisions. And state constitutional provisions are a rich source of opportunities and issues for you to think about. And really what we hope you will do is remember them. Remember every time you have an audit, an appeal, to think about whether there may be a state constitutional right that you can assert. And we're not talking just for litigation purposes. In fact, most often the benefit of raising a constitutional issue isn't for litigation at all. Instead, it is for its settlement value, either in an audit negotiation or also in an appeal negotiation, and also in litigation, where you've got a statutory issue and you raise a state constitutional issue and you use that as leverage to get the result you want under the statute. So the first area that we're going to explore are uniformity clauses. Most states have a uniformity clause. Now some states say you actually in their constitution use the word uniformity. Some states will use equality, proportionality. But the gist is the same, that the taxpayers need to be treated equally. Now, some state constitutions, the uniformity clause only applies to rates. Okay? In some state constitutions, the uniformity clause only applies to property taxes. But in a number of state constitutions, the uniformity clause applies to all kinds of taxes, income taxes, sales and use taxes, revenue-generating fees, really anything, and requires a level of uniformity among taxpayers. So we're going to explore that first, and we're going to do that by using our first icon, brook trout, as an example. I'll turn it over to Sebastian to explain what we mean.
Thank you, Kyle. So there are many types of potential uniformity violations that exist in the sales tax context. And many of these go unchallenged because they apply to a smaller group of taxpayers. Take Pennsylvania's treatment of brook trout, for example. The trout that are behind me right now are the 5 common Pennsylvania trout, according to the Pennsylvania Boat and Fish Commission. Pennsylvania's legislature has decided to provide for a sales tax exemption for the first 3 types of trout, but has not provided for an exemption for the last 2 trout. So by doing this, arguably the Pennsylvania legislature has created 2 classes of taxpayers as a result of this exemption. They've created people that sell and use brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout, and another class of taxpayers who are all other users and sellers of trout.
The lake trout people.
The lake trout people.
Whose lobbyists apparently weren't as good as the brook trout lobbyists.
That's a great point. And the Uniformity Clause arose in the context of the legislatures providing special tax treatment, whether it was beneficial or subjecting taxpayers to higher rates than others. And when viewed in that context, even a simple example like the taxability of brook trout can raise uniformity concerns. So now that we've identified 2 classes of potential taxpayers, the question is whether the distinction is reasonable or whether it's unjust and discriminatory. And in the context of the historic reasons that the Uniformity Clause was enacted, the Commonwealth might have a hard time arguing that they had a reason to separate users and sellers of trouts into different categories and impose disparate tax treatment on them. So that's a sales tax example of potential uniformity violations. Kyle, what are some of the areas that you see this in income tax?
Sure. So another area is distinctions based on size. We had last year a decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in the Nextel case, in which the Pennsylvania Supreme Court concluded yet again that Pennsylvania cannot distinguish, the General Assembly cannot distinguish among taxpayers based on the amount of their income. So they can't distinguish, for example, in that case, based on income taxpayers who had income greater than $3 million. They were disadvantaged under the law. Their net losses were capped. Pennsylvania Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional. That violates the Uniformity Clause because you can't classify based on level of income. And that, that sort of decision has ramifications for other taxes. In Pennsylvania, for example, there was a recently enacted provision in the Philadelphia BIRT. That's the Business Income and Receipts Tax. The tax folks love their acronyms. The BIRT. And the BIRT had what was adopted by not the General Assembly, by City Council, was exemptions from the receipts tax. The Business Income and Receipts Tax, as the name suggests, has an income component, a receipts component. Well, the receipts component, what's exempted is right now, it's the first $100,000 of receipts. Now there may be good policy reasons for that, but the problem is in Pennsylvania, it violates the Uniformity Clause. I think both the Supreme Court's decision in a case called Mount Airy and more recently the Supreme Court's decision in a case called Nextel says a jurisdiction in Pennsylvania cannot distinguish based on the level of receipts. So Philadelphia has put its business income and receipts tax in jeopardy by essentially exempting large swaths of small taxpayers. We've also done, Sebastian, you may know, a whole one of these teleseminars on the business income and receipts tax. There's a whole bunch of other issues with it. So I think one of the things that's a takeaway, aside from the generally applicable constitutional issues, is that there's a refund opportunity for most taxpayers under the BIRT. With that, I'll turn it back to Sebastian to talk a little bit about the Appropriations Clause.
Thanks, Kyle. So yes, let's turn to state constitutional appropriations clauses. So while states may seem to have a potentially limitless desire and ability to spend taxpayers' money, there are some constitutional limitations on that budgeting process. For example, some state constitutions require that the governor must propose a balanced budget. Other constitutions are stricter and require that the legislature actually enact a balanced budget. Where we want to focus our attention today is state constitutional requirements that the legislature must make all budgetary appropriations as part of a single bill in 1 year. And the constitutional requirement that that all appropriations must be made annually and as part of a single bill makes sense. It requires that the legislature consider what they're spending their money on and to balance spending priorities on an annual basis. So tax earmarks or tax statutes that require revenue to be spent on a specific item potentially run afoul of these constitutional provisions because they arguably remove the determination of spending from the legislature's purview.
So if a taxpayer who's listening to this is dealing with a statute that earmarks or appropriates money directly to something and doesn't do that obviously as part of the annual appropriations process, it's just sort of this permanent earmark appropriation, that's something that taxpayer should look into. They should look to see, does the state that's imposing that tax have a provision in their constitution that actually requires an annual evaluation of spending to determine, hey, is it really a priority to be earmarking the $100 million that comes from this tax to this one thing?
Absolutely, and taxpayers in Massachusetts have done just that. So there's currently a ballot initiative that's being proposed that would impose a 4% surtax on annual incomes over $1 million. And Massachusetts, like many other states, has a provision in their constitution that requires that the budgetary process be conducted via a single appropriations bill. And in addition to imposing a tax on high wealth individuals, the Massachusetts legislation would specifically earmark the approximately $2 billion of annual revenue from this proposal to transportation and education. And it would be a constitutional amendment, so that would arguably tie the hands of future legislatures if they wanted to use that money for, say, healthcare or housing. They wanted to redetermine their spending priorities. So that is currently before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and we'll see where that ends up.
And so that is good. That is something that would be on the ballot, that needs to go on the ballot. And the question is, can you put something on the ballot that essentially violates the Appropriations Clause? And of course, if you ever want to pick up a few extra votes to get a ballot initiative or a piece of legislation across, earmark the money for education, right? Because it seems like you'll always pick up a few more votes if you do that. And all kidding aside, what it does is it really, I mean, who is going to vote against something that's for education? So goes the theory, but there of course are other spending priorities. There's transportation, there's aid for the poor, and so on. And the fact of the matter is the Appropriations Clause is designed to force the General Assembly to prioritize, all these things, that each of them are good, and decide, well, how are we going to spend the limited resources that we have? So now what you probably wondered at the beginning, so what are we going to do with the garbage, with the litter, right? So this is where the garbage and the litter comes in. It comes in the Appropriations Clause. It's our little sort of iconic discussion to make you remember the Appropriations Clause. And again, don't focus just on this issue. It's a New Jersey issue. It relates to those who sell consumer goods, packaged goods, food in wrappers that could cause litter. But it's not just about that. It's really not about the tax at all. It's about where the money from the tax goes. So New Jersey adopted a litter fee. And it adopted the litter fee and earmarked the money, it's about $20 million a year, to what's called a Clean Communities program. Who could ever think of a better name than the Clean Communities program? Who wants to fight against clean communities or a program for clean communities, right? So the legislators are nothing if not creative and like to sort of pull on the heartstrings. So what the legislatures did is they imposed essentially a tax, gross receipts tax, on wholesalers and retailers of food and other consumer products, cigarettes, and other packaged goods that come in wrappers. And the idea is that the gross receipts tax goes into a fund, this Clean Communities program. But it's earmarked into that fund. It says $20 million from the tax to go straight into that fund without going through the annual appropriations process. And then what happens with that $20 million is it gets divvied up among various localities in New Jersey. The problem with that is that we think it violates the New Jersey Appropriations Clause. New Jersey, like other states that Sebastian mentioned, requires that the General Assembly sit down every year and make the hard policy decisions about picking how to prioritize spending state money. And when you take a tax and you just sort of direct it out of that process, it sort of defeats that purpose. What's interesting about New Jersey is if you look at the New Jersey Constitution, there are several earmarks, but they're in the Constitution. They're so important. There are education earmarks, but they're part of the New Jersey Constitution. So in our view, if something is so important that it needs to be earmarked as a permanent priority, the Constitution has to be amended to do that. So for those listening in, obviously the main takeaway is if the tax is being imposed on you and the money is being earmarked to a particular place, check that state's constitution. I guess the lesser point is those of you who are paying the New Jersey litter fee have a refund claim. We're challenging this in the New Jersey tax court. So take a look if you're selling food or other packaged goods into New Jersey, you may have an opportunity there. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Sebastian to talk about non-delegation.
Thanks, Kyle. So let's talk about non-delegation in the context of federal tax reform. So as many of you know, the federal government decided to make sweeping changes to the Internal Revenue Code in December of last year.
They did?
Kyle loves tax reform, he's just joking. And so this change at the federal level had an immediate impact on the state determination of corporate taxable income. And that's because most states determine corporate taxable income starting with the federal definition of federal taxable income. So a big change at the federal level is going to have an impact on the state tax base. Now, states conform to the federal definition of the Internal Revenue Code in a couple different ways. A lot of states will conform to the Internal Revenue Code as it exists at a certain date. Now, those states would have to look at the legislation that was enacted in 2017 and make a decision to adopt it. So the legislature would presumably weigh the options and weigh the provisions and decide whether or not to incorporate them into determining state taxable income. Another group of states conforms to the Internal Revenue Code on a rolling basis. Now, in those states, the legislature does not need to take any action to automatically incorporate the federal changes, at least into the starting point for determining their state's corporate taxable income. And in those rolling conformity states, a number have developed constitutional law that says that the state cannot delegate its legislative authority to another body. The legislature was granted the power to legislate for the people of the state, and they can't shirk or delegate that responsibility to some other body. And some states have, Minnesota in particular, has analyzed this concept of non-delegation of legislative authority in the context of conforming to the federal taxable income on a rolling basis. And the Minnesota Supreme Court determined that their statute had to be interpreted such that they do not conform on a rolling basis. That is, the Minnesota Supreme Court looked at the Minnesota legislation that said that state taxable income starts with federal taxable income, and said that the only constitutional way to interpret that provision was that the legislature incorporated the Internal Revenue Code at the time that statute was enacted.
Because otherwise Minnesota legislature would be delegating to Congress.
Exactly, and then from that point on, any change by the federal government would automatically be incorporated into Minnesota law, and that would be an illegal delegation. So I guess the takeaway here is that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017 is such a sweeping change that it potentially represents a non-delegation issue in states that conform on a rolling basis. And so you might ask, well, what states can I make this argument? So as I said, it's rolling conformity states and states that have developed a non-delegation constitutional principles. And in fact, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania has consistently held that legislative delegations of power are unconstitutional. In fact, in 2017, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court held that the Pennsylvania legislature delegating to the American Medical Association's definition of disability for the purposes of workers' compensation law was an unconstitutional delegation.
And that's probably less of a politically charged question than deciding winners and losers in a tax code. So, but even there, where it's fairly, one could say, technical in the scientific use of the word, the Supreme Court would have nothing with letting the General Assembly get off the political hook, not take political responsibility for itself defining those disability criteria.
Right, exactly.
And here, Sebastian, we've added in a little graphic where we've got rolling conformity meeting the non-delegation limitations. So we're going to end with the single subject clause, and this is our fireworks portion of the presentation. So what is a single subject clause? Most state constitutions have a provision that requires that any bill that's going to become law cover only a single subject. And now, usually the rules for what constitutes a subject are fairly liberal. In other words, the courts don't want to second guess the legislature's determination that various things are related to a topic. Pennsylvania, for example, says, well, as long as all of the items that are included in the bill are germane to a theme, then they are part of they constitute single subject and they are okay. However, if they're not, they violate the single subject clause. And what's particularly important about a single subject clause case, and the whole idea, by the way, for the single subject clause provision, the reason it's in all these state constitutions, is so you can't take ideas that would only garner a minority of the votes cobble together sort of maybe 2 or 3 ideas that would only have 20-30% of the votes each, and create a package that then passes. So no majority would ever pass any one of the ideas, but as long as you package them together, you can get a majority for the whole thing. And the drafters of the state constitutions thought, well, this isn't what we want. We want each idea essentially to rise or fall on its own. So the problem is if a law violates the single subject clause, the whole law goes, because the court doesn't know what portion of the law would have passed without the ungermane, irrelevant add-on. I mean, the things are irrelevant to each other. It's not like there's something that's irrelevant to the overall bill. The court doesn't really know sort of what's the thematic piece of the bill and what's sort of the add-on. The court just views them both as essentially being necessary to get the thing passed. So it puts the whole bill into jeopardy. So what's an example of this? A recent example is Act 43 in Pennsylvania. Act 43 that was passed last year in Pennsylvania provided a couple of important tax things. One was it imposed responsibilities on marketplace providers, online marketplace providers who facilitate sales. It requires reporting obligations or tax collection obligations from them. The other thing that the law did was it fixed Pennsylvania's corporate income tax net operating loss deduction. As I mentioned before, there was some litigation around the net operating loss deduction, violated the Uniformity Clause, and the General Assembly came up with a fix and included it as part of Act 43. The problem is, though, that in addition to all that tax stuff, the General Assembly also completely reworked the regulation of fireworks.
And you're saying that those are unrelated?
The Phantom Fireworks is saying that they're unrelated. So a company called Phantom Fireworks has sued and said, look, by the way, Phantom Fireworks doesn't like the new fireworks legislation. Interestingly, they think the new fireworks legislation is too weak. They like the old restrictive fireworks legislation because they had built buildings, et cetera, on the basis of complying with the old fireworks regulations, and they say the newer regulations are weak, and they allow competition to come in and with fewer safety constraints sell fireworks. But suffice it to say, they don't like the new fireworks regulatory regime. And what they're arguing is that the General Assembly, by putting fireworks regulation and tax provisions in a single bill, has violated the single subject clause. So if they're successful, a likely outcome would be that the entirety of Act 43 fails, and those tax provisions would have to garner support on their own, again, by the General Assembly and get passed by the governor. And that could be difficult. So it's something to watch, and I guess the bigger picture is whenever you're dealing with a particularly nettlesome tax change, take a look at the legislation that passed the tax change and be on the lookout for what seemingly completely unrelated things in that legislation, and then take a look at your state's constitution, likely, because most states have it, there's a single subject clause in the Constitution. And then the question is, okay, if this is really a real problem for my company, this tax, can I challenge the tax on the basis that it violates the single subject clause? So that brings us to the end of our program. Thank you for joining us today. Sebastian and my contact information is on the screen in case you have any questions.